I'm Mercedes Stephenson, and this is the West Block: politics, perspectives, and players. It's been over 7 years since the civil war began in Syria. Hundreds of thousands of people have died, and millions more have been displaced as refugees. 4 years ago, a group of volunteers formed an organization called the White Helmets. They operate inside Syria to pull civilians out of the rubble after bombings and help them escape danger, as well as access emergency medical services. As we head into the second month of the October ceasefire deal, those working on the ground with the White Helmets fear that peace will not hold. What does this mean for Syria? Late last week, I sat down with the Syrian campaign policy advisor to the White Helmets. Here's that interview. Kenan Rahmani joins me now. Kenan, you've been to Syria many times. I know you are on top of this file. We don't hear about Syria as much anymore in the news. So can you begin by giving us a bit of an update on what the situation is right now on the ground in Syria?
Yeah, absolutely. Great to be here with you. I think, it's unfortunate that Syria has gone out of the spotlight because it remains a very important part of the world that, there should be much more effort to try to secure the situation there. Right now, there's a de-escalation agreement that was agreed upon by Russia and Turkey, which was implemented in the middle of October. And that agreement established a buffer zone around the last opposition stronghold in northwest Syria. And the agreement is that Russia and Turkey will patrol that buffer zone. They will ensure that there aren't violations of the ceasefire by either side. And unfortunately, what we've been seeing in the past week is an escalation from the Assad regime onto rebel groups that are inside the stronghold. And then we've seen return fire from the rebel groups onto the Assad regime. So it looks like the ceasefire maybe is in a fragile state and could fall apart in the next month. Obviously, we hope that doesn't happen. Idlib is an area in which there are more than 3 million residents. Half of those have been evacuated from other areas. And the thing that makes Idlib very unique is that there's nowhere left for people to be evacuated to. So if this area were to fall under the control of the Assad regime, probably through a very violent military offensive by the Assad regime and Iran and Russia, that would result in possibly 1 million refugees, and that would be a huge catastrophe.
How much of the country does Assad control right now?
This is another, misconception, is that people say Assad has won the war. The reality is that Assad controls little more than 50% of the country. The rest of it is controlled either by the Turkey-backed rebel groups in the northwest or by the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces in the east and northeast, which the US-led coalition has leveraged to fight against ISIS. And Assad controls, major population centers, a lot of territory, but if you look at more than half the population of Syria is displaced, millions of refugees, Assad really doesn't control that much of the country to be able to say that he's won the war.
I know you have family in Syria and you go in and out of Syria. How would you describe the experience of being there?
I mean, it's something that for us living in America, we can't relate to it. You go in there, there's bombing on a daily basis. There's, families who have been completely separated. Either, the brothers and sisters are now in Germany or in other parts of Europe or in Canada. And, many families have loved ones who are in the Assad regime's detention facilities. There are possibly 95,000 people who have been detained by the Assad regime. Most of these were peaceful protesters and activists who we have no idea where they are. There are many people who have had their loved ones killed by barrel bomb attacks or by chemical weapons attacks. And these people are just, now all they want is just to live. They want to live with their dignity. They want to have a normal life. And unfortunately, that's just not possible as long as the Assad regime is controlling and Russia is dictating the future of the country.
Do you think we've seen the worst of the violence, or is it that things have slowed down a bit now because of these agreements, but it could easily slide back into the cadence that we saw before?
I mean, I really hope that we've seen the worst. I really don't think that the Syrian people can endure more tragedy and more destruction. But I just don't understand, as long as you have the Assad regime, which has been the one responsible for 90% of the violence in the country. And as long as you have Russia and Iranian militias, I mean, 80% of the Assad regime's ground force now are Iran-backed militias, Hezbollah and Iraqi militias, and militias even from Afghanistan and Pakistan that are aligned with the Iranian regime. As long as you have all of these in the country, that's going to be a magnet for for ISIS, for Al-Qaeda, for whatever other extremist organizations develop. And what is the long-term solution to this conflict if it doesn't involve a real political solution that takes the Assad regime out of power, that holds accountable everyone that's committed war crimes, regardless of if it's the regime or the opposition, and gives Syrians a stable future that allows them to have a voice and a democracy that they can be a part of?
Why do you think Western countries have failed to act, have failed to do something about the human rights violations and the atrocities in Syria?
Well, I think that the world has forgotten not just Syria, but people, there's conflict around the world, and countries that in the past used to rise to the occasion to defend these populations, to stop dictatorships from massacring their own people, haven't done that. And obviously there have been a lot of mistakes throughout history in Rwanda, in Bosnia, in Kosovo. There have been a lot of times where we waited too long to act to protect people, and we've seen the consequences of those humanitarian catastrophes. But in Syria specifically, I think that the Obama administration came in 2009 and looked at the failure, looked at the Iraq War as a failure, looked at it as something that generated more humanitarian catastrophe, ruined to some extent the reputation of the U.S. military's efforts, and wanted to change that. Wanted leading from behind and pivoting to other parts of the world, focusing on economic partnerships and other things. And that left a vacuum. There was a vacuum of leadership when the Obama administration decided to do that. And then when you had the Arab Spring, from Yemen to Libya to Iraq to Syria, we see the failings of the international community to rise and confront extremism, to confront authoritarianism, and to confront the basic human rights of people in that region.
How do Syrians see the world now, after this happening to them, and the hope that maybe NATO would come to their rescue, or the United Nations, or someone? And at the end of the day, it's a group that you've worked with very closely, the White Helmets, Syrians helping other Syrians, who have done more to save lives in desperate situations than any of the big international institutions.
Yeah, I mean, it's heartbreaking to see the hope being crushed. I think, just as painful as it is to see 500,000 people killed and millions of refugees, millions of children who have been out of the education system and have no futures now, just as heartbreaking as it is to see all of that, it's just as heartbreaking to see the hope crushed in people, that there is an international community that cares about democracy and cares about human rights. Syrians now have seen the United Nations Security Council, which is supposed to maintain peace and stability in the world, as one of those members of the Security Council is dropping bombs on them, is vetoing investigations into the war crimes that are being committed by the Assad regime. And that has led Syrians to have a complete change in the way that they view the world. I mean, the Assad regime has always told the Syrian people that the US is your enemy and that NATO is your enemy and all of these, but people didn't really believe it. But now they're seeing for themselves that the international community hasn't stepped up to save them. And unfortunately, some percentage of Syrians have turned to violence as a way to try and make things right, but that will never work either. What we need is an international community that takes its role as the defender of liberal democracy seriously, and we need for that international community to come in and save Syrians and save other people who are persecuted around the world.
Canada took in 40,000 Syrian refugees. Now we're bringing in some of those White Helmets who have managed to escape Syria after Assad began targeting them. Is Canada doing enough?
I mean, everyone can do more. I think the vacuum that's been left by the United States not leading in this effort should be filled by all of the like-minded countries that do believe in liberal democratic values and do believe in the protection of human rights. And I think Canada definitely has a role to play there.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. That's all the time we have for today. I'm Mercedes Stephenson for the West Block.